What's going on, YouTube? I thought that I would start a new series of chess videos. This one will be very sporadic, as it will be an ongoing series. It will be a series based off of my own games. So, essentially, as I play really good games that I think are of great educational value, that are of great instructive value, I thought, hey, maybe I can add them to a series, maybe I can analyze them, maybe my audience will find them very interesting. So, in this particular game, it was a game that I managed to win against a national master at my local club. National master Hugh Siddeley, who is kind of a club regular at the Annex Chess Club, and he also is a regular at Chess in the Park as well. Oh, as am I. I am a regular player at both of those. So even though I did manage to win this game, and even though it is a rated game, keep in mind that it was also a club game, so the stakes are not as high as if it were, say, at like a tournament like the Canadian Open. But it's still a rated game. We're both still taking things fairly seriously, and it is still a game of great instructive value, a game which you might actually learn quite a few things from looking at. Like, normally, I like to analyze games played by titled players, and I myself am not one, at least not yet. But this game, I think, is a really nice one, and I think that even titled players in the audience will look at this game and go, wow, this is some really fascinating stuff. So, without further ado, let's get to the game. So the first move of the game, I had the white pieces, was b4. Now, no, don't click away from the video. Okay, I think I'm gonna have to explain myself here. Why did I play this move? What is going on? Well, this opening, known as the Sokolsky Opening, is an opening that I do enjoy playing from time to time. And I used to play it a lot more, but part of the problem with this opening is that Black has quite a few good choices, and some of them can even lead to a very dry and boring position. But I do think that this opening b4 is actually appropriate for club players, and it's even fine for beginners to play this opening, in my opinion, as it can kind of be played like a system, kind of like the London system, where beginners like to close their eyes and play the same moves against everything. Like, you can kind of do that with this opening as well. But as you get stronger, like as you become a better player, you generally don't want to play this opening against lower rated players because they'll generally go for the really dry and boring stuff. But there can still be a case to be made for playing it against higher rated opponents, because higher rated opponents don't really want to go for a line that's very dry and equal, because that could just lead to a draw. They want to win with the black pieces, so they will very often play either e5 or d5. In the game, my opponent played pawn to e5, but I thought I should talk a little bit just about this opening in general if you want to learn a bit more about it. So, first and foremost, like, how do you kind of refute this opening? Like, if you want to play something really dry and equal as black, what do you do? Well, in my opinion, one of the best ways for black to deal with this opening, like, this might not be the most accurate move order, but the general idea is black can kind of just copy us and get a very boring and symmetric position. And, like, notice that the pawn is under attack. Black didn't take it earlier because, black should not blunder this. So, push this, bishop e7, bishop e2, castle, c5, c4, d5, d4, or like this position. It's very symmetric, it's very dry, it's very boring, You turn on the engine evaluation, it's just 0-0. Oh, this will probably just be a boring draw. This is, an easy way for black to equalize against this opening. And, white does still have some potential winning chances given the pawn on b5. Like, maybe white can do something with this imbalance over here. But in general, this development scheme that I'm highlighting here with all of these, all of the circles around these pieces, this is a way that you can develop against most setups. Like, you can play like this against, like, b4, d5 setups. You can put your pieces like this against, like things like the Dutch, things like the King's Indian, whole bunch of different setups. You can develop your pieces like this. But the more critical lines to worry about, to really worry about, that you really need to study, lie in b4, e5. And if you're facing a higher rated opponent, then you're very likely to see b4, e5, because e5 is the most testing line, it's the most critical. Well, it's the one where black is checking, does white actually know what they're doing? This line here, b4, e5, it often leads to some very interesting, very imbalanced positions with a fair amount of chaos where both sides have winning chances. So a higher rated opponent will very often go into this. They'll very often play b4, e5, or they'll play some b4, d5 line. They usually will not go for something symmetric like the line that I just showed, where they just copy how we develop our pieces. So b4, e5, if you're going to play b4, you really have to study b4, e5, because it can get very theoretical, and you can get blown off the board if you don't know what you're doing. So here, in this position, after b4, e5, black has, moved their pawn forward, they're fighting for central space, but they're also attacking our pawn on b4. So the best way to react like this, assuming we're playing the Sokolsky and not playing like the reverse St. George, which would be pawn to a3, is to develop our own bishop and counterattack this pawn. And here, the most common line that you'll see strong players play is the exchange variation, the exchange Sokolsky. That's when black plays bishop takes b4 and we play bishop takes e5. We basically trade the pawns. This is very common and leads to very interesting positions. In the game, my opponent instead played f6, which is also a line that you have to know about, also have to be careful about. So very briefly, I thought I should talk about the exchange Sokolsky, as it is very common. Like, if you play b4 against a high-rated opponent, you'll very likely get this. And so here, black will generally play knight to f6 because pawn on g7 is under attack. And here, white has two main choices to look into. So c4 is kind of the old classical line that you would often see. Like, you might see knight f3 or e3 be played first, but generally c4 will be played at some point just to fight for central control. But c3 is another line that has been seen much more recently. Like, I think even Magnus Carlsen has used c3. I think he used it against Nakamura and Anish Giri. So c4 is pretty interesting, but I kind of like black's chances. Like, if you play c4, black has a fair number of choices, but black will usually castle kingside, white will develop, black will strike at the center, white will play e3, kind of similar stuff as what I showed earlier, like this knight f3, e3, maybe bishop e2 kind of stuff. And then black has a number of moves here that are all good, like rook e8, knight c6. c5 is fine, just fighting for central space. White can take on d5, white can play a3, number of things that can happen. Takes, bishop e2, getting ready to castle. Black has a number of choices here. Knight c3, knight c6, attacking the bishop. White doesn't want to trade their bishop for the knight, especially since their dark squares on this diagonal will be a bit weak. You always have to watch for scary stuff like that. If the bishop vanishes. Bishop f5, O-O, and overall, the engine actually prefers black here. Like, black is doing pretty well here. They're like, these moves are just moves that are very commonly played like between strong players. And overall, I kind of like black's position as well, but the position's still fairly interesting. It's still fairly imbalanced. A much more recent idea back in this position is, of course, pawn to c3, and the idea behind pawn to c3 is that we're going to make a nice big center, even if it means having to trade the bishop for the knight. Like, some players will just kind of take immediately and then play d4, that kind of stuff. So this is a much more recent idea, and I think it's very interesting, although there aren't a whole lot of games in the database to study. But FIDE master Karsten Hansen has done a bit of research on this line. Like, he's written a book on how to play the Sokolsky that kind of goes through a bunch of opening preparation that you can use. And if you want a bunch of model games on the Sokolsky, then I also recommend taking a look at a book by international master Yuri Lapshan. Like, some of the theoretical ideas that he discusses in his book are a little bit suspect, like, the Tartacover gambit, as well as there was, I think, a line where white plays queen c1 to get out of a pin when black plays bishop g4. I thought that was very silly. But the model games are excellent. So if you want theory, I recommend taking a look at the work by FIDE master Karsten Hansen. And if you want model games, I recommend taking a look at the work by international master Yuri Lapshan. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. My opponent did not play the exchange variation. They did not play bishop takes b4. Instead, they played pawn to f6. And this is also a fine line for black to play, although black does have to know what they're doing, as it is a little bit double-edged. Black is going to take a very big center. Like, black's whole idea is they want to play d5. White's pawn on b4 is currently under attack, so white probably should react to that. But the downside, of course, is that you're playing f6, and as any good Ben Feingold fan knows, you should never play f6 because it weakens these diagonals. It can expose your king, and you have to be a little bit careful whenever you're doing this. So in this position, the move that I like to play, and the move which Alexei Sokolsky actually prefers, is the move pawn to b5, and that was what was played in the game. But I thought I should briefly mention the Tartacover gambit, which is a line that I don't like. I don't think the Tartacover gambit is any good. So that is when white now plays the move pawn to e4. This is the gambit. Black takes the pawn. White gets aggressive. White's going to try to attack, make use of these weak diagonals. And then black has a number of good moves here. Black has a number of ways to play. Like, a gambit isn't so good if your opponent has lots of good options that you have to deal with. So knight e7, for example, is the most common. Queen h5 check. And here, white is kind of hoping for black to play knight to g6. White is hoping for this so they can get aggressive with f4 and, have all their pieces, like start, not caring about the fact that they're going down 2 pawns. Like, this position here is actually okay for white. Like, that something very interesting is going on when you're going to go down 2 pawns and the engine says that you're only very slightly worse. That you have some kind of compensation whenever that's happening. But black doesn't have to play knight g6. Instead, black can just play g6, and it's like, what are we even doing? Like it's minus 0.6, but that's only if white plays queen f3. If white plays anything else, then it drops down to -1, which essentially implies that black is up a pawn and white has no compensation for it. Like I don't like this gambit. I think this gambit is dubious. But I thought I should just briefly mention it. This is not what happened in the game. instead, after pawn to f6, instead of playing e4 and throwing away the b4 pawn, instead I played the move pawn to b5, and this move was part of the reason why I was able to win this game, is because my opponent expected the Tartacover gambit. And they probably, read through Lapshun. Like, they were probably familiar with Lapshun's work, where Lapshun himself seems to really like the Tartacover gambits. But b5 is good. b5 actually has very good winning chances. Like, white wins 50% of the games here and draws 27%. That's a very good win rate. And this is master level. This is the Lichess Masters database. So this leads to kind of a very imbalanced position where black is going to take the full center. Like, black's next move is going to be d5, but white has this interesting pawn on b5 that's, kind of annoying, black's knight a little. And white does potentially have these diagonals to play against. But of course, white has to make sure that they don't get overwhelmed by black's big center. White has to, make sure that they fight for the center themselves. So in the game, black now played pawn to d5. I continued with pawn to e3. And basically, there are two moves that I want to play here, like two potential moves, like either one is good. Like, basically, the idea behind e3 is we want to either play c4 or we want to play d4. We want to challenge black in the center. Like, just because we're playing some really weird offbeat opening, that doesn't mean that we should be ignoring sound opening principles. It's like, ideally, we want to, be opening up the center a little bit. It's because black has kind of weakened their king, and black hasn't really been developing any pieces. They've just been pushing a bunch of pawns everywhere. So I played e3. I want to play this move, ideally. My opponent stopped that by playing bishop to e6. So since I can't play c4, I instead played d4, or challenging the center this way. Like, this move does make my bishop a little bit unhappy. Like, now the bishop is, staring at a pawn. But maybe I can open things up. Maybe, like, if my opponent takes here, maybe I can take back with the bishop, or maybe even the queen, since, the knight can't come here. That kind of stuff. But my opponent did not want to allow that. My opponent played pawn to e4. And now, in this position, what's very interesting is that the move that I now played is actually kind of a novelty, and it's a very logical move, and it's actually one of the best moves for a white to play. Okay, so I guess in a sense, this game is kind of like a model game for the, or it's a model game for the move that I now played, which is knight to e2. Like, the engine evaluation is kind of strange. I don't really trust it here. Or like, when I get other depths, when I turn it on, the engine's like, yeah, knight e2 is like the second best move, or something. Like, in this position, the other moves that have been played are knight to d2 and pawn to c4. But I like knight to e2. The idea behind this move is actually very simple. Like, I can't develop my knight to f3, and developing it to h3 is very silly. Like, you'll just double my pawns, mess me up that way. So I instead am seeing this square for my knight. This is a very nice square where I want to put it. And if it gets there, it'll attack this guy with tempo. Oh, and it'll put some pressure on this pawn. And my opponent probably should not play g5, because there might be queen h5 check ideas, with the knight coming to g6 perhaps, and the pawn can't take because queen takes the rook. Things like that. So I like knight e2, even though this move has never actually been played between titled players. So my opponent sees that I want to play knight to f4, so they play bishop to d6. The engine does not like this move. The engine instead wants to go pawn to a6, but we're kind of both in some very unexplored territory here. Here's some very weird, interesting stuff. There isn't really any opening theory that we can, that either one of us would have had access to that would tell us what the best moves are. Here, we're kind of both just relying on our own skills and on our own experience. So my opponent played bishop to d6, stopping bishop to f4. Very reasonable move. Here, in this position, challenging the center with c4. This move sacrifices a pawn, but only temporarily. And black kind of has to accept the sacrifice because the immediate threat is pawn to c5, which will kick this bishop away, and then I could play knight f4. That's really annoying. My opponent does not want to let me do that. So my opponent, of course, accepted, my little pawn sacrifice. And now here I made a move that's, quite cool, very interesting. I played the move knight e to c3. Now, this move probably seems very strange. It's like, wait, doesn't this knight belong on c3? And the answer is no. There are kind of two main reasons why I put this knight on c3. Reason number one is I want my bishop to be putting some pressure on this pawn. I want my bishop to be coming to life, maybe be able to develop, number of stuff. Basically, I want to get my knight out of the way. Like, my knight doesn't really have too many good squares to go to, like maybe g3, but I kind of like having it on c3 because it's attacking, this guy over here, or the pawn on e4. And the other reason, the second reason, is that this knight is actually very well placed on d2. If I move the knight to d2, then it targets both of these things. It targets both of those pawns. It'll be doing very well there, and it'll be working together with the knight on c3, so rather than the two knights being tripping over each other, they would instead be working in harmony. And as we can see, due to all of this pressure that's coming from my pieces that are attacking, going to be attacking both of these pawns, my opponent can't really hang on to both of them. My opponent has to choose one of these pawns to give up. So my opponent's next move was knight to d7, and in my opinion, this is kind of already where my opponent started to go wrong. Like very often, like when you're in weird, unexplored territory, when you're in weird openings where your opponent has to make some interesting choices, that's often good. Like, that's often good from a very practical standpoint because there's a fair chance that your opponent might choose wrong because, they've never seen this position before. They might not know what's going on. They might not, have a deep understanding of what it is their plan is, what it is they should be trying to do. So the reason why knight to d7 is wrong is because this pawn is the better pawn. This pawn is the pawn that my opponent should have been hanging on to. Instead, a better move would have been f5 to support this pawn. I keep it here because this pawn's pretty annoying for me to deal with. It's controlling some important squares in my territory. Whereas this pawn is very weak. This pawn is going to be lost. It is going to fall, but my opponent really shouldn't be trying to save it. They should be trying to save this guy. This guy is not weak. This guy can be defended by his friend on f5, whereas this guy cannot be defended by, the b pawn over here because my pawn is in the way. Like, notice that my b pawn, even though it seems so strangely placed, it's actually playing a role in my plan. It's actually doing something useful. It's stopping my opponent from playing b5. So in the game, my opponent played knight to d7, giving up the pawn on e4. I, of course, took it, kind of taking it with tempo. I'm threatening to maybe take the bishop over here, perhaps. My opponent played bishop to b4 check, and here I played the move bishop to c3. The idea behind bishop to c3 is basically I realized that this bishop is quite bad. Like, my bishop, it's very unhappy. Like, not only is it staring at a pawn on this long diagonal, but even if this pawn were to move, like, what is it even doing here? The f6 pawn is very, very well defended. And the bishop, it's just having a lot of difficulty getting into the game. Like, Maybe it could come to d4 if the d4 pawn were to move, but overall, it's very hard to make use of my bishop. I would be happy to just trade it away. Okay, so that's why I played bishop to c3 to block the check and also counterattack. Like, now this bishop is under attack. My opponent has to react to that. So my opponent played queen to e7, defending their bishop, and I played pawn to a3, insisting on a trade. Being like, no, I really want to trade, but I don't want to play bishop takes b4 because that will allow you to bring your queen to b4 with check. No, I want to trade on my terms. I want, to force my opponent to take on c3 so that I can take back with my undeveloped knight. I can bring another piece into the game in the process. Yes. But, basically, my opponent could have played this move. They could have played bishop to d6. But instead, I would just trade knight for bishop here. And then after pawn takes, I could play d5. Like, I could, in a way, be improving this bishop by getting the pawn out of the way. After a move like bishop f7, for example, you could play queen d4 and attack the pawn on c4. And that's if, that's if after retreating the bishop to d6, my opponent takes back with the pawn. Taking back with the queen is, not a good idea in my opinion. Like in my opinion, bishop to b4 looks very scary. Very just activating the bishop this way. Although a better move is actually just to play knight to d2, just adding more pressure onto this pawn over here. We're getting ready to take it. And then after knight to b6, maybe playing a4 to try to kick this knight away. That kind of stuff. This is not what happened in the game. But one thing that's very interesting is that after a move like queen to d7 to free up this square for the knights and all that kind of stuff. Wait, what am I saying? That doesn't quite make sense. But anyway, after a move like this, you could play pawn to e4, and it would actually be white who has the big center. So I think that's a pretty interesting line, but that's not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened in the game was black took on c3. I took back with my knight. And here, my opponent played a move that's a little bit inaccurate. They played knight to b6. The problem with this move is that it gives up the c5 square. So my knight is going to come there. Instead, a better move for my opponent to have made here would have been for them to have played f5, kick this knight away, since if the knight goes here now, then, I'll lose a pawn for seemingly no good reason. So after a move like knight d2, then knight b6 would work, because my opponent does want to defend their weak pawn. Potentially this could become a pass pawn and it could be a good pass pawn if my opponent is able to somehow get a pawn to b5. So it would make sense for my opponents to be trying to defend it. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, my opponent played knight to b6, and I now played... Oops, sorry. No, not that move. Sorry about that. I sometimes misremember things. I didn't play knight to c5 right away, as there's actually a move that's much more critical here. Here, much better. Instead, I played the move queen to f3. Basically, if I remember correctly, it was important to do things in this order because there were, I think, some bishop to d5 ideas or something like that. I think that was the reason. Maybe it doesn't actually matter the order in which this is done, but part of the idea of queen to f3 is to bring another piece into the game, and when I play knight to c5, this pawn becomes very difficult to defend. And this, defending this pawn becomes quite annoying. And so basically my immediate threat is knight c5, winning the pawn on b7 because it can't be defended. My opponent tries to block with c6, I can take. Notice that I am making use of the b5 pawn. It is doing something useful. It's not just, an awkwardly placed pawn. actually a very valuable resource. So after queen to f3, my opponent played rook to c8. My opponent is ready to meet my move knight to c5 with the move pawn to c6. Blocking my queen along this diagonal and also adding defense to the pawn using their queen. So in this position, I did not take my foot off the gas. I kept being aggressive. I played queen to e4. I am now attacking the bishop, and this position is actually very uncomfortable for black to deal with. Like, basically what's going on, like, the immediate problem is that if black moves their bishop out of the way, say, for example, to d5, and I can take over here, and if black takes with the knights, then I can just, let's see, I can take here because I have this threat of knight d6 check. But it's important to note that if black takes with the king, I should not take on b7 right away because of a discovered attack. So instead, e4 would kick this bishop away, bishop to f7, and then knight takes b7 would have me go up a pawn. And, that would be pretty good. Like, I do still have to keep an eye on this guy, of course. Like, black might try pushing it, but given that queens are off the board, it does become a lot more practical for me to, move my king closer to deal with this pawn if black starts trying to promote it. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Back in this position, I'm attacking my opponent's bishop. We saw what happens if my opponent moves it away. We saw that the pawn on b7 will fall. So my opponent doesn't really have any nice ways of defending the bishop, except for one. And that way is king to f7. Not a move that you generally want to make. This is not a happy move because it basically means that you're surrendering your castling rights. It means that black can't castle anymore. So I decided to now take on c6. And my opponent decided to take back with the b pawn. And I thought this was an interesting choice. Like, I thought that my opponent was actually going to take back with the rook to, maintain the integrity of their pawn structure. And if my opponent does take back with the rook, then I would probably play in a similar way as happened in the game. Like, I would basically just play bishop e2 and just castle kingside. I've already kind of provoked a bit of a concession from my opponent in the fact that they can't castle anymore and that their development is pretty awkward. They have to bring their knight in this way somehow. Now things are a little bit strange. But this is not what happened in the game. My opponent did not take with the rook. Instead, they took with the pawn. Part of the idea of taking with the pawn is that it does add, more support to the d5 square. My opponent might try putting a piece on d5, like maybe the bishop will be very well placed there. And I really don't want to trade for anything on d5, because if my opponent is able to take back with their pawn, then this pawn becomes very strong. This pawn will become a protected pass pawn and will be very annoying. Like, especially with a rook backing it up, with the rook, trying to push it down the board and all that kind of stuff. Even though the knight's currently in the way, my knight's doing a pretty good job of annoying my opponent, so that's cool. But basically, that's the general idea that my opponent was probably going for here. You're just trying to be very strong on the light squares, add some support to d5, and put something on the d5 square. Now, the downside of this move, the downside of this recapture, of course, is that this pawn structure is awful. This is very, very difficult to defend. Like, all three of these pawns are essentially isolated. They're kind of all isolated pawns. They cannot be defended by their neighboring pawns. They have no neighboring pawns. They're all just targets for me to attack. These pawns, if they have to be defended, they'll be defended with pieces, which you usually don't want to be defending pawns with pieces. You want to usually be defending pieces with pawns. Like, pieces are for offense, pawns are for defense, generally. But another thing to note, of course, is that these particular weak pawns are in a lot of danger because they're both blockaded, and they're both blockaded by knights, which are the best blockading piece. So anyway, that's enough about that. I decided to play bishop to e2, just develop another piece into the game. My opponent now went for bishop to d5, and the engine thinks that this move is a bit premature. The engine instead wants pawn to g6, which I think is actually a very logical move. The idea of pawn to g6 is that black could play pawn to f5, then knight f6, then maybe bishop d5, or maybe with a different order. It probably doesn't matter too much, but the general theme is that black will have a very strong grip on the light squares, and will be, trying to go for some counterplay. Like normally you don't want to be pushing the pawns in front of your king like this, but we have to be concrete here. It's actually pretty difficult for white to attack black's king, especially when white has not yet castled. Like, if we're gonna attack black's king over there, we're gonna be wanting to have our rook be on the f file and maybe play like f3, e4, stuff like that. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, my opponent played bishop to d5. I now played queen to g4, applying some pressure over here. My opponent has to make sure that, this knight doesn't lose sight of their rook. Also, the queen is defending the pawn on g2. My opponent played h5. I now played queen to h3, keeping my queen on this kind of menacing diagonal, and also threatening to take the pawn on h5. Like, we do have to be worried a bit about pins and stuff, although the pin doesn't immediately work because, basically, if I were allowed to take on h5, my opponent would not be able to block with g6, because, I could just take with check and then take the rook, that kind of stuff. So my opponent does have to be careful a bit about this bishop takes h5 check stuff. Like, I would likely have time to maybe move my queen to keep defending the bishop, although I myself have to, of course, worry about tricks with bishop takes here and then rook takes there. But anyway, my opponent decided, no, I'm not going to allow any of those potential possibilities. He's going to play pawn to g6, defending the pawn on h5. So here in this position, I made the only bad move. Like, the only bad move I made in the entire game. I kind of went about this a little bit incorrectly, but it's not a move that loses for me. It just wasn't the best move. So in this position, I played the move bishop to f3. Engine really does not like this. And the best move is actually a very forcing line, and it is a line that I saw, but not one that I evaluated correctly because I'm not a great endgame player. So instead, what I should have done is played e4. This is very forcing. The bishop is under attack, and this pawn is very well defended. So after my opponent retreats the bishop, I can then take. Like, I could probably actually take with the queen. That's probably a little bit more forcing. And then after take here, king takes, play a4, basically be trying to win this pawn on c4. My opponent can't really prevent it because my opponent is not fully developed. If my opponent plays a5, I can play rook b1. And if my opponent tries defending their knight, like, remember that if the knight moves away, then I win this pawn with check. So my opponent can't defend their knight because their other knight is in the way of defense of this rook. I could take on c4 with check and basically be up a pawn. After king d6, bishop to a2, knight e7, and probably in this position, white is just doing fantastic. Like, white will win this endgame. White is doing very well. Like, white can castle here or bring their king out to d2 or e2. And white just has much more active pieces. White has pretty strong grip on the center and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not that great of an endgame player, so I didn't really evaluate, this line as one where I would be winning and all that kind of stuff. I kind of have a bias towards, trying to keep the queens on the board and all that kind of stuff, which is a flaw. Like, that is not good. That is not a good habit to have. Like, in general, you should be always trying to make the best move, regardless of whether it suits your style or not. Like, the best move is the best move. But instead here, I played the move bishop to f3, trying to challenge this bishop on this diagonal, all that kind of stuff, and maybe add some support to the e4 pawn break, all that kind of stuff. So this was kind of a missed win because, what's it called? That whole forcing sequence with e4 and then trading on e6 would just lead to a very, very nice endgame where white will be doing extremely well and will most likely easily convert. And my opponent traded on f3. I'm not quite sure why they did this. Like, this actually kind of surrenders a fair bit of advantage back to me and stuff. This bishop on d5, it's a pretty useful piece for black. It's kind of holding everything together, and I kind of really don't want to trade on d5 myself for the reason that I mentioned earlier. Like, I want this pawn to be weak. I want to be able to attack that pawn easily, and having the pawn on d5 is kind of a problem. Like, instead, a better move for black in this position would have been f5, like a very multi-purpose move. Like, basically, it blocks this diagonal. It also, adds some control to the e4 square, which will be important if I do trade something on here, because, one way that I could try to undermine the defense of the c4 pawn would be by playing e4. And like, f5 is just a great multi-purpose move. But my opponent probably did not want to play f5 because it is pushing a pawn in front of their king, and that can be pretty risky. But it's actually pretty difficult for white to attack black here. It's like, usually in a situation like this, you want to blast open the center, and you want to, have your rooks like be on like these files here and just, attack. But that's very difficult to do, especially when my own king has not castled. Like, I could castle here, but there isn't really an attack here, but intuitively f5 is a little uncomfortable for my opponent's play, so I can understand why they didn't do it. Instead, my opponent took on f3. While I can say that I can understand why they didn't play f5, I don't understand why they took on f3. This kind of just gets rid of one of their best pieces and trades it for one of my worst pieces, which was the bishop, which wasn't really doing a whole lot. Anyway, my opponent played knight to h6, trying to bring their knight into the game since its other squares were occupied, also connecting the rooks. I castled. My opponent brings their knight to f5, good square for the knight. I play pawn to a4, trying to, get ready to kick this knight away. I want to attack this pawn, all that kind of stuff. My opponent plays rook h d8. The engine instead wants king g7. The engine is a little bit mysterious. I think rook h d8 is a pretty intuitive move. It's a move that I would probably make even if you did tell me that the engine says it's inaccurate. I probably would still make that move because it's at least a move I can understand, whereas, like, I guess king g7 makes some sense, trying to get your queen, like, get your king away from where it's aligned with the queen, but I think this move is fine from a practical standpoint. I play rook fc1, putting the rook, same file as this pawn. Rooks belong on open files. My knight is getting ready to move out of the way. Okay. And so here, my opponent now played the move pawn to a5, trying to stop me from playing pawn to a5 myself. Oh, the engine instead wants knight to d7, and like in general, black does have a bit of an issue with space, so it does make sense to try to trade some pieces away when you're kind of a little bit cramped. Although there is arguments against trading pieces when you have weak pawns, because those can be attacked easier in the endgame when you've got less pieces. But anyway, opponent played pawn to a5, stopping me from playing a5. I now play rook a b1, because this rook isn't really doing much on a1, it's just defending this pawn, but that pawn is already very overprotected. Rook comes to b1, attacks this knight, tells it to move away. My opponent moves their knight to d5. Very sensible active square for the knight. Right, although, let's see. An issue with this move, like something that my opponent probably missed, is I now have the move knight to b7, which forks the rook and pawn. One thing that's interesting to note is it's actually very hard to find a good move for black here. Like black is kind of collapsing in this position, and this is probably part of the reason why a5 was inaccurate, was just that black doesn't really have a good way of defending this knight. If black plays rook to b8, for example, then I just eat this pawn and I attack the knight once again, so that's no good. And one thing that's very cool to note is that black does not have queen c7. Queen c7 does not work. If you want, you can pause the video now and try to figure out what white would now do, like why queen c7 simply doesn't actually help in defending this knight. I will reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. So the reason why queen to c7 doesn't actually help defend this knight is if white takes and black takes back, rook to b1, and oh no, the queen does not actually have a good square to retreat to. The queen is going to be captured. If the queen goes to c7, for example, then rook to b7. Rook to b7 pins the queen to the king. Like, notice this. And so, as a result, what will happen is black will have traded queen and knight. Like, remember that I sacrificed my rook for a knight, for 2 rooks, which is a fantastic trade for me, but is not a good trade for black. Like, a queen versus 2 rooks, that's generally a fair trade. Like, sometimes the queen is better than the 2 rooks, sometimes the 2 rooks are better, but queen and knight versus 2 rooks, I think the queen and knight are going to be winning that. Since queen and knight actually coordinate very well. They, in fact, generally coordinate better than queen and bishop do. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, back in this position, we see that my opponent's position is kind of collapsing. My opponent has to move their knight. My opponent chose to move their knight to d5, the most active square. I play knight to b7, attacking the rook and the pawn on a5, and getting ready to gobble up material. My opponent responds with rook to d7, moving the rook, attacking my knight. I take the pawn on a5, yum yum yum. My opponent takes my knight over here. Another important thing to note is that I'm not done taking pawns. These pawns are under attack as well. Oh, I'm going to be attacking those things. Rook takes c3. It's now pretty much impossible to save this pawn. This pawn is a goner. So my opponent didn't just lose one pawn, they're losing the other one. My opponent plays pawn to c5, trying to save this one. Play rook takes c4. And here my opponent played rook d c7. One thing that's interesting here is that a very resourceful try that black could have gone for, which is very difficult to see and looks very scary to play out, like leads to a lot of chaos, would be the move knight to h4. And part of the reason why my opponent might not have seen this is because they were actually starting to get into time trouble at this point. Like, I actually had a pretty healthy lead on the clock. Like, I think I was generally keeping a lead of about 15 minutes on the clock. Like, I was trying to spend roughly about as much time on each move as my opponent was, while at the same time, staying ahead by about 15 minutes. So if, we get into time trouble, I will have lots of extra time to make critical decisions. But anyway, a more resourceful try by the opponent, which the engine sees, is the move knight to h4. And the point of this move is after a move like queen to e2, my opponent can try going for some tricks with queen to e4. A very scary looking move because, we're lining up the queen with the rook like this. But the point is that, queen takes g2 is mate. So white has to immediately react to this. And we probably don't want to be playing pawn to f3 since that kind of weakens our king a fair bit. That's a little scary move to play, although there could be argument for it. Although, forgot to mention pawn to f3 is no good because of this. Silly me. So, queen to f1, pretty much the only move here. Knight takes g2 is a playable move here. Here, black could try this. Could try sacrificing their knights for a few pawns. Try damaging white's structure. Try to weaken white's king a fair bit. And then white can actually play d takes c5 here with a discovered attack. And this is just very, very chaotic. This is kind of a mess. White is still quite a bit better here. White is doing extremely well here. But this is much more chaotic. This is much more complicated. So this would have been a better try by black. But it's not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened in the game is black played the move rook d c7, just protecting this guy over here. And so I now play the move pawn to d5. The point of pawn to d5 is I want to get in the move knight to c6. Like my knight on a5 has been doing a spectacular job, but he'll be doing an even better job on the c6 square. So my opponent now played the move knight to d6. And here, I kind of got a little bit too fancy here. Like, the move that I played in the game works out. It's okay. Like, at this point in the game, I had about 10 minutes left on my clock, and my opponent had 2 minutes. So, basically, I spent about a couple of minutes here calculating my next move, calculating a few variations, but really, here, I should have just kept things simple here. Here, I think the best move for white, from a practical standpoint, is just to retreat the rook. Like, just play rook dc1. I can play knight c6 on my next move, and, then win this endgame, because, this pawn is going to be very difficult to defend, with the knight interfering with the rook's defending it, and all that kind of stuff. But this is not what I did in the game. Instead, I decided to get really fancy here and go for a kill shot. Go fully aggressive. I played the move knight to c6. Very aggressive move. In fact, this is actually kind of a this move essentially sacrifices a knight. Right? Like, I saw that I'm basically sacrificing a knight here, but it's like so aggressive. Like, it works out. It works out okay, but you have to be really careful when you're playing moves like this. Like, Grandmaster Ben Feingold has a rule, never sacrifice. And, the reason why he has that rule is because, lower rated players especially are not going to fully calculate all of the defensive resources that their opponent might have against the sacrifice. Like, if you're going to sacrifice material, you have to be very, very sure that it works. Otherwise, you could end up just throwing away a won game. Like I was already super winning. I don't need to make things more complicated than they need to be. So knight to c6, very flashy move, but it kind of overcomplicates things. So here, the reason why this is a sacrifice is my opponent can just take with their knight. Take my knight with their rook. I take back over here. Knight takes c4. So white has sacrificed their knight, but white has quite a few attacking resources here, including this move, rook b7 check. Now, I should note, of course, is that white will very likely regain the knight because queen d5 check does pick it back up, and I did calculate that. I did make sure that that was there. Or like it's kind of like, you know, calculating a sacrifice and seeing that you at the very least have a perpetual check if the attack that you get doesn't work. But anyway, I played rook to b7. Looks like this pins the queen to the king, but my opponent has rook to c7, blocking the pin. I now play queen to d5 check, working the king and knight, but more importantly, forcing my opponent to move their king. And my opponent was in time trouble, so they kind of immediately they played a move that loses immediately. This move is not a blunder because other moves also lose. But basically, my opponent played the move king to g7, and I now play the move rook takes c7, and my opponent resigned. The reason why my opponent resigned is because after queen takes c7, I just played the very simple move queen to d7 check, forking the king and queen. My opponent has to take, otherwise they lose their queen. I take back. I've got a pawn on d7, and my opponent has no way to stop it. I'm going to play d8 equals queen on the next move, and my opponent's knight is too far away. My opponent's king is too far away. The game is over. However, it should be noted that other moves are also bad. Like, other moves don't really help my opponent's situation. Like, king f8 seems like the best try. Right? And here, after king f8, I can now go for rook to b8 check. King is forced to go to g7. Otherwise, you know, just losing material for no reason. I can now go for queen to g8 check, king to h6, and now queen takes c4. And my opponent cannot play rook takes c6 here because I have an immediate threat. The threat, of course, being rook to h8 check. And if my opponent plays king to here, then this is mate. And if my opponent plays king to g7, then this is mate. So my opponent has no time to take the pawn on c6. So all of this works out tactically. Like this attack, it works. Like you can probably see from the engine evaluation earlier from this position, that it's all sound. But, you know, I did kind of make things a little bit more complicated for myself than they needed to be. But anyway, as I mentioned before, after queen d5 check, king to g7, I played rook takes c7, and it was in this position that my opponent now resigned. So I hope that you enjoyed this game. Like, I certainly did. Like, this game, I think I played some really fantastic chess, even at the points where I did make some mistakes. Some really, really cool chess. As like, especially in such an offbeat opening that you don't see much, much usage of. Like, if I could, I would actually submit this game to the Lichess Masters database, but I'm not a titled player, so I don't think they would accept it. But overall, I hope that you enjoyed. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, and I'll try to keep playing some very good chess, and hopefully I'll have some more games as good as this one to feature in this series. So until next time, bye for now.